Hello and welcome to the 20th episode of the KurosawaCast. I am, as always, your host, Rob Beams, and I'm joined by my good friend, the film maker and the film teacher, Craig Ennis. Hello, Craig.
Hello, you all right?
Yeah, good. How's things?
Good, yeah, good. Busy day, but it's the weekend now, and a festival of football is about to start.
That is true. So for those not initiated, the KurosawaCast here, we're watching the films in chronological order. Craig had never seen any of them previously. I am a fan who's seen them all at least once before, many of them multiple times over. This time around, we're looking at his 1970 film Dodes'ka-den, his first film in the post-Mifune era, his first colour film, and his first film after a break of 5 years since making Redbeard. So before we get into the film, I think it's good to give a little bit of context into the pre-game on it, because obviously there's that break, there's that 5-year break. And that break isn't him just sitting on his hands, not trying to make a film. There's lots of things happen in that time. So how familiar are you with what went on between 1965 and 1970 for Akira Kurosawa? You might have heard of one or two. Okay. You'll have heard of some of the projects.
I know that there was I believe there was Tora.
Yeah,
he was involved in that. Which was supposed to be him and I don't know, John Ford. I can't know. There was some mainstream, some big Hollywood director was gonna. They were going to do a 3-hour film, half of it about World War II, half of it from the Japanese point of view with a Japanese director, half of it from the American point of view with an American director, and Kurosawa was lined up as the Japanese director for that, and that for whatever reason didn't happen with him in place.
Yeah, no, was originally told. You're almost 100% right. He was originally led to believe David Lean was directing the English side of it, the American side of it. But sources vary on how accurate that ever was, because it's suggested, for example, in the Donald Ritchie book, that they might have used David Lean's name as a way to make Kurosawa think the film was going to be overall a lot more prestigious than it was, and that Kurosawa might have thought that with David Lean's kind of directorial star power on it as well, that he would have more power and say than he ended up having, because it wasn't going to be just like a studio production, if you like. But those things didn't end up coming to pass. So what happened was, as we covered last time, Redbeard in 1965 was actually his biggest box office success to date. Absolute huge success in Japan. And then his contract with Toho expires in 66. I'm a bit fuzzy on this, because from, I think it's the Bad Sleep Well On, it might be just before that.
I'll forgive you, Rob. It's 20 years before your birth, and it's in Japan.
But there's a period from which on that he's making films with his own production company. And he's not making them for Toho anymore, but Toho is still the distributor. So when it says that his contract with Toho expired in 66, I guess that must be a distribution contract or something, because he's making the films himself at this point. But he goes off in 66 to make Runaway Train in the US. And he runs into problems straight away with Runaway Train, because apparently he takes a long time on the script. Because remember as well, with his films, they're increasingly taking a long time to make. Redbeard was like being made for about 2 years, and it was the longest gestating sort of Japanese film project ever.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's just the fact that they're the stories that stand out, and you don't take notice of the middle ground, but always seems to be, I either wrote it overnight with a bottle of sake, or this is like the long
saga. Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. And the problem that he first encountered with Runaway Train was that he was taking a long time on the script, particularly getting the script right in English. And that caused some frustration for the studio. I can't remember who it was he's working with on this one. But he was trying to make Runaway Train. Then he wanted to film it in real snow, like not on sets and whatever with fake snow. So they had to delay shooting until near the end of 1967. which is a familiar Kurosawa thing as well. Like it's him wanting to do exactly as he wants to do it and kind of moving things around to make it happen. And by 1968, the film was officially cancelled. But at that point, he moved on to work with Daryl Zanuck at Fox, making Tora Tora Tora. And it's exactly as you just said. I'm not going to go over that again. What happened was he started working on it. He only actually did 3 weeks shooting of it in sort of December of 1968. But what happened was Daryl Zanuck got wind of the fact that Kurosawa during that 3 weeks had shot a bunch of stuff and then decided he didn't like the color of any of the sets and how it turned out. So he wanted to do it all again and change all the sets, which is something that, like, if you followed, as we have, his last 10, 15 years in Japanese cinema is par for the course. There's not necessarily something Daryl Zanuck at Fox wanted him to be doing. And basically his budgets were massively cut. Kurosawa's script, which I'm assuming means just for his half of the film. I don't think he ever was writing the American half of the film. Kurosawa's script was for a 4-hour movie. And he ended up having to cut that down to be half of a much shorter movie. So that caused tension. And then there's the fact that Zanuck just wasn't giving him the same leeway or the same artistic freedom as he was used to at Toho. So there were huge issues going on. And by the end of 1968, he was kicking off so much about various things that Fox tried to get him off the project. Now, in order to avoid, I guess, some sort of legal issues from firing him off the project, and I guess having to prove something to do with why they were firing off the project, they declared he was insane publicly. What Fox did was they got some doctors to come out and said that Kurosawa was mentally unwell and that he'd had to be removed from the film because he was crazy. And what Kurosawa did in his very, as we talked to about in his early years, is very Alan Partridge sort of response to things in general. He actually
drove to Aberdeen with no shoes on.
Yeah, eating nothing but Toblerone. What he did to prove that he wasn't crazy was he called. I originally wrote down in my notes a press conference that he held, but actually I was corrected reading Ritchie's book. It's press conferences. He called multiple press conferences with a team of doctors so that they could attest that he was
well. Amazing.
This was going on in early.
I was just I was mixing up my Zanucks there as well because I was thinking about Richard Zanuck as well. But so I just double checked Daryl Zanuck's filmography. I think Tora 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 was his last film as well. So maybe it finished off Daryl Zanuck as well as as knocking out Kurosawa for a few years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, that's probably what happened because this was, by all accounts, a fiasco. So. He has to prove that he's not crazy. He gets these doctors out to say he's not insane. During the time working with Fox, and I couldn't find a lot of details on this, it was something that there's just like a couple of sentences here and there about that you find, but I couldn't find the actual meaty details. But apparently his production company, in working with Fox, found out that there was loads of corruption going on within Kurosawa's own production company, which the where I read it noted that was quite ironic given that he'd made The Bad Sleep Well a few years earlier. So this also caused a decline in his kind of happiness, but also reputation at the time. And all of this causes a big storm in Japan as well, because as again, you'll remember from the earlier episodes, Kurosawa wasn't really somebody who was thought of particularly highly in Japan. All of his prestige in Japan came from the fact that he was suddenly really well respected outside of Japan, right? And he wins these awards in Venice, and Americans like his films, and everyone's raving about his films. And suddenly, because the outside world is paying attention to Kurosawa, Japan is paying attention to Kurosawa. But when Hollywood says that the man's insane and that he can't make a film and that nobody can work with him, and he has these 2 failed attempts to make a film in Hollywood back to back, that makes him persona non grata back in Japan and destroys his reputation back in Japan. So Ritchie talks about how at this point as well, he can't get funding to do something in Japan after the fallout of this. And it all leads to basically...
it's a pretty quick kind of
fall from grace from his biggest film ever,
because he's like you say, Redbeard is not even necessarily like one I'd heard of before coming into this endeavor, and you say he's most financially successful, but like demonstrably having made like a handful of classic movies all of a sudden just no gone.
Yeah, and this happens at an unfortunate time for him as well, because in the mid-60s the Japanese film industry is coming into contact with TV in a big way, and TV, obviously the same issue that happens in Hollywood and elsewhere of TV taking people away from the movies. But the Japanese film industry reacts to TV in a very different way to Hollywood. Hollywood reacts to TV by making everything bigger. Everything's in cinema scope and everything's on massive sets, and How the West Was Run, and there's going to be 5 directors and 90 stars, and it's going to go on for 4 hours, and it's just bigger and bigger and bigger. Japanese films, they get their budget slashed to just be more like TV, which is why Ishiro Honda's original Godzilla in the 50s is like a really great film, and then all Ishiro Honda's Godzilla films from like the 60s look like Power Rangers, like that's what they look like. They look like TV, and it's because a Japanese cinema goes, oh shit, no one's coming to the cinema anymore. Let's slash all the budgets. We're just going to make shit now, and this is why when Kurosawa comes back to Japan to make a film, it's in the interests of a few other of the kind of auteurs of the era to try and get him allowed to make another film, because they also want to continue to be allowed to make these films. So what you get is Kinoshita, Ichikawa, and Kobayashi, who are 3 of the other kind of big names of Japanese cinema at the time. I mean, bearing in mind that Ozu and Mizoguchi are dead at this point, those are probably the 3 other greatest living Japanese filmmakers at the time. And they come together with Kurosawa to form a production company called, somewhere in my notes here, Yonki no Kai Productions. They make this production company, and it's Kurosawa and these 3 guys, these 3 great directors, and they're going to come together to finance him making this film. And it's this situation where I think they wanted this film to be a big success that they were helping him to get made, and then this production company would then be a vehicle for them to make other films, and what ended up happening was Dodes'ka-den ends up being a massive financial disaster and a critical bomb as well. And it means that this production company, this is the only film these guys will make together for this production company. But that leads us into sort of talking about Dodes'ka-den. I will just say one more thing on the front end here, which is that after the failure of Dodes'ka-den, which comes out in 1970, in 1971, Kurosawa attempts suicide. As a result, lots of people obviously you can't attribute a suicide attempt to one thing, but it's often attributed to the fact that he had just had this period of just critical and commercial rejection, basically. And the way Ritchie talks about it in his book is with the idea that it seems, and okay, I'll take this with a slight pinch of salt because it's obviously a sensitive topic, but like Ritchie talks about it in terms of the fact that it seems extreme to a Western mindset that he decides this and takes this action, but that within the context of the Japanese art world, suicide is sort of a romanticized thing that lots of prestigious novelists and painters and things throughout time have done at the end of their career as a kind of like, I am done now statement. So he sort of talks about it as being slightly less shocking that Kurosawa attempted suicide within a Japanese context than I guess it would be from like an American or a British standpoint. But nonetheless, it's extreme and luckily doesn't work. I will just mention one other thing, which is in 1971, he actually made a TV movie before his suicide attempt, which is the only Kurosawa film I've not seen, which is called Song of the Horse, and it's a documentary about horses. And I would love to see it. If anyone knows where I can get a copy, I'd love to see it. But basically, if his suicide attempt had worked, the Song of the Horse, made for Nippon Television, would have been his final film. But anyway, that's the preamble and some of the post-amble. Last time, I always ask you at the end of each episode what your expectations are. And I remember for Dodes'ka-den, you didn't really have any, right? There wasn't really anything you were thinking of. How did it meet or those non-existent expectations?
I think when we looked at the synopsis for it, obviously there was a very strange image that I saw of a very dirty-looking man and an older man, but it wasn't clear from the makeup actually if it was like dirt or if it was like horror makeup almost. And then it kind of said, basically there was a load of waffle that was meaningless, and and on the BFI player, and it mentions a suicide attempt, which made me think it didn't have anything to say about the film. And then it mentioned the lower depths as well.
Which I can see the similarity to the lower depths.
Yeah, and if Hidden Fortress is kind of a stealth remake of Those Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail, then this is a stealth remake of the lower depths.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, you're not wrong.
So I didn't really have much to go by. I mean, the title gives nothing away but it makes sense almost straight away within the film. Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I went into this thinking. I don't know what I didn't really have much to expect from it, to be honest.
I think you'd mentioned to me in a message the day before that it wasn't one you were looking forward to, that you were sort of preparing yourself for a little bit of a slog on this one.
Not necessarily a slog, but certainly mediocrity. Simply because it's not talked about. Although I discovered that this I thought it got an Academy Award nomination.
It did. It's since been reevaluated in some quarters, because in the most recent, obviously, because in the most recent Sight and Sound, I think the 2012 version of the Sight and Sound poll, where they say that they get people to vote the top 250 films of all time, the Dodes'ka-den brothers named it as one of the best films of all time in their list.
I can see that. I can see it appealing to it. It actually felt like it had quite a European sort of sensibility to it in that sort of in a strange sort of social although it's not particularly social realist in the way that it looks quite a lot of the time. There's some real striking looking art direction and color work and stuff like that. It reminded me of either kind of a mix between sort of European social realism and a bit of a Robert Altman film. It's an ensemble kind of vignette-y kind of film where you just drop in to this slum, and you're guided through it by I had real trouble picking out anybody's names in this film because you just jump from person to person, but you're guided through it by this young man who lives with his mother, who spends his days walking from one end of the slum to the other, pretending or believing that he's driving a trolley, like a tram, and picking up passengers and sort of pantomiming the whole thing, and making the noises, which is the title, the Dodes'ka-den.
Yeah.
That's what he says. It's like the sound of the trolley, which doesn't strike me as what a trolley would sound like, but there's probably a backstory to that. It probably comes from somewhere. So it starts off with him and his mother kind of chanting very aggressively in there, doing their morning prayers, and then he goes out, gets himself ready for work, puts his glasses on, and sort of walks through this slum, and the kids are kind of shouting trolley freak at him and throwing rocks at him, which very much reminded me of my childhood growing up on a council estate. For anybody who didn't quite fit in, the kids would be quite brutal, but he just ignores them all and goes on his way, walking from one end of the slum to the other with his trolley 8 times in the morning and 8 times in the evening. And as you walk with him on the first one, you kind of see the other people coming in and out of their houses, and then you just sort of drop around the houses and spend a bit of time with all these different people. I don't know how many strands are there. You've got a kind of a
young flower seller girl who's being abused by her uncle. You've got you've obviously got the trolley boy. You've got the
although he doesn't really have a story. He's more of a guide, isn't he? He kind of
you get the silver worker who doesn't really have a story either. He's kind of pops into other people's stories. There's a kind of calm influence. Like there's that burglar who comes in and he just gives him some money, and there's that guy going crazy with a samurai sword, and he just kind of calms him down. Like he's just a kind of a nice dude.
You've got the guy with the really aggressive wife and the physical tics. Who defends her when people start having a go at her. You've got
the man who lives in his car with his son.
You've got the women washing the clothes in the center of the square and just gossiping about everything else that's going on.
Which, when you put it like that's a very Kurosawa setup, isn't it? He likes those kind of areas, like in Seven Samurai, but also like in, I guess, Drunken Angel and lots of his other films. There tends to be kind of towns arranged in that way where everyone's around a kind of little central area where people gather.
And and then you've also got there's one more. You've got the wife swapping drunks. Just kind of happily like everybody's up for it. They just kind of swap spouses on a night by night ad hoc basis. So you've got these kind of 6 or 7 or 8 different little stories, and you kind of drop in with them, and then sometimes somebody walks past somebody else and you move on to a different story, and then or sometimes it will just cut. There's no real I couldn't discern any particular structure in how we jump from place to place, but that's what reminded me of Altman or later Linklater and Paul Thomas Anderson and all that kind of stuff. It's that sort of thing. So the film kind of like succeeds or fails really all based on how you respond to these individual stories and if you like the people that you're spending time with. And to be honest, like it could be quite subjective depending on which stories you respond to, because if you've got 2 stories you don't like that happen to be back to back quite often, it might kind of take you out of it for a little while and that kind of thing. But I kind of enjoyed it.
Yeah, I was struck by 2 things, because I'd seen this before, but my memory of it was a bit hazy. And the 2 things that really struck me about it were watching it in order, because I think last time I'd seen it, I'd been watching other color films of his, like Dodes'ka-den and Ran and stuff. I think watching it kind of in order, you see this as his introduction to color, and he really assaults you with color right off the bat. Like the opening credit sequence is almost like Wes Anderson-esque, sort of like bright primary colors, very symmetrical frames of really nice kind of music. It could almost be like a Wes Anderson, Alexander Desplat sort of opening title sequence. And then after that, you get like again this kind of really aggressive use of color, where he's got like it's in the chapel sequence we talk about, where they're at but not chapel, but they're praying at their altar. The train guy and his mum, and all of those pictures on the window and the light filtering through them. He's got so much color.
Yeah, this guy who pretends to drive the train, he's probably in his 20s, but he's clearly kind of like mentally developed. He's a child, and he's got this childish drawings basically that cover every surface, aren't they? And immediately you can, like you say, assaulting with color, but immediately you can just see how much more detail and thought you pick out within the frame, just immediately, just how much more is kind of given to you as an audience, or is more readily accessed. God, I sound like such a tosser. Like that in terms of information, like, because you get a sense, straight off the bat that there's something odd, but you're not quite sure what's going on within the house, because the guy takes himself very officiously, doesn't he? And he's very kind of this that. So you think maybe there's a younger child that we haven't seen or something like that. But there's all this. What's really nice is that it's the mother's clearly worried through the performance. She's clearly worried about her son, but it seems like they have a comfortable, stable life within that space. It's a hovel, but it's clean, and it's been set up and it's homely, and they have a routine. And he goes and walks up and down the the slum for 16 times a day, and she stays at home and makes sure everything's and then you move into somebody else's house, and it will be, some of them are much better kept than others, some of them are much more darker or brighter. There's like a real sense of the production design for the different kind of houses is really kind of helps you kind of keep track of exactly where you are. I thought
the thing that was really struck me with the color as well was that it wasn't like he just, to me anyway, like it seemed like it wasn't just like he made, his next film. It happened to be, I don't know, Sanjuro, Yojimbo 3, and it happens to be in color. It's like he decides he's making a film in color. So the whole thing seems conceived to kind of use color. And what I mean by that is you get these sequences in it that just wouldn't play the same or make any sense in black and white. You get, particularly, I'm thinking about two particular moments or strands you get in it. One is the boy who's pretending to be a trolley. There's a sequence where he starts looking around and seeing these kind of big, colorful, like pastel sort of like stars in the sky and all these, the moon and all these kind of backdrops and things. And then the other one, which is like a recurring motif you get through the film, this recurring thing that happens, is that the guy who lives in the car with his son, the kind of homeless guy, he has all these scenarios where he's talking about this dream fantasy house they're going to build together, and they always cuts to these really overly colorful, like candy cane sort of color, like
David Lynch Blue Velvet kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And you'll get him talking about this fence that they're going to have, and then you get him talking at the end about the swimming pool or about building this thing on this hill and all the light coming off of it.
This imaginary house is kind of pieced together, piece by, and you see it, don't you?
You do, and it's something.
But it's not just that kind of that blue velvet look of those scenes when you see this imaginary house. It's the contrast with that, with the design of their kind of rusted car that they live in, and the dirt and the filth that are on them, that are, like I said before, it's such extreme makeup. It's almost horror makeup. And then later on, they get food poisoning in it, and the makeup becomes purple or green or really, really unpleasant. Like they are by far the most sort of indigent characters within this slum.
Yeah, that takes me on to
they really look it as well.
Yeah, that takes me on to the second thing that I was going to say, because there were two main things that I took from this. One was really how he's kind of done it with color, and he's so expressive with color. And the second is that from the setup and from the beginning with the guy being the trolley and everything, in my mind, this is always a more whimsical film than it actually is when you watch it. Because the thing is, it gets dark in places, this film, in a ways that take me by surprise, even though I've already seen it.
Yeah, no, because it's quite whimsical and fun for a little bit, and the funny drunks and their kind of
the wife swapping drunks and the guy being a trolley and all this stuff that's going on.
It's quite funny, but then you've got a rather like harrowing and but not exploitatively explicit like rape and incest scene, and it's not just the scene, it's not just the seeing, it's the kind of it's the build up to it, and the kind of the performance of the actor who she's quiet, she's a quiet character throughout, and then you're kind of, you get that slow realization of why she's timid and meek, and it's a really good, it's actually really quite a thoughtful portrayal of abuse.
For Japan in 1970, this is a really, really thoughtful depiction of like a child abuse situation going on in a house. And it's strange because Kurosawa doesn't touch subject matter like this with a long stick for most of his career. And the first time we saw anything like this was watching Redbeard, right? There's that scene where the woman who's described as the mantis, isn't it? Where it talks about, she talks about her past and being sort of sexually abused as a child. And that's the first thing we get in Kurosawa that's really anything in that direction. Like, he doesn't go near that. I suppose obviously there's the rape in Rashomon, but this is very specifically like the child abuse. And then we get that right back off the bat again here with Dodes'ka-den, and even worse, not to rank child abuse, but just like, it's like a really, really harrowing depiction that you watch in this case. It isn't like a much older woman talking back on it from a place of potentially being an unreliable narrator or, you know, trying to kill this guy as we get in Redbeard. We actually see this happening to this young woman. As you say, we see how beautifully acted it is from her, why she's quiet. We also see the kind of the gaslighting and the insidiousness of her uncle, who's talking to people about, he's clearly done it, but he's talking to people about other people who've potentially done it and blaming her and blaming everybody else. And it's very well done.
And it's there's two things that go along with it. It's the how easily he maintains domestic life whilst doing this, to begin with at least, and then the consequences for the girl as she as kind of like her emotional stability breaks and spills out into violence against others as well. It's kind of it works as a really kind of complex short, really, if you were to take it out and put it together. I thought that was really good. And then obviously you've got that's really subtly done. There's also the tragedy of the child, which is kind of a bit more signposted, a little bit more maudlin, and kind of a little bit less deftly kind of touched on, but no less kind of affecting, as you sort of know right from the off, because the dad's, I mean, you know, he's kind of like a buddy dad. He's not really looking after his son. He's kind of like, he's like this font of knowledge and kind of very kind of authoritative, or at least he is to a 6-year-old's child. And then the child goes off to collect scraps from restaurants as part of their routine, and one of the chef says to him, "Make sure you cook this fish before you eat it." And when they go to eat it, he says to his dad, "We've got to cook this," and his dad says, "Oh no, you don't have to cook that. You've got that wrong." And they eat it, and you kind of know from that, you know from there, like how that story plays out, basically. But it's no less, you know, it's lovely performance by the child as well. Like that, I've noticed a few good child performances actually in Kurosawa films.
Redbeard as well was a notable one, but it's interesting because if you remember that scene from Redbeard we talked about in the last episode, where the women in the kitchen that this young boy's stealing from, they take against this boy and they're calling him a rat. But then when they see the cause of it all and they understand his home life, they kind of rally around him and want to look after him. And a very similar thing happens here, where there's a prejudice against this boy's father and against their situation, which sort of stops a lot of people in the shanty town from wanting to intervene and help, like as early as they maybe could have. But actually they then become aware of the tragedy behind it all, you know, when originally they have this kind of prejudice against it, which is here to a much more tragic end. Although in Redbeard that boy's brothers and sisters all do get poisoned, so it's maybe equivalent, but it's played more for tragedy here, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, if the strongest story, so like I say, it's vignettes, and like when we talked about the Lower Depth, we were saying that felt like it was a play or almost like a sitcom. Look, he's going, and it's very difficult to keep track of who's in and who's out and what's going on and where are. This is much easier with different spaces to sort of follow the different strands, and it is really about the strength of the individual stories. So they're not all those are
the two most memorable ones.
They're the two most memorable. Yeah, they're not all created equal. Like the one with the one about the guy with the wife, and nobody likes the wife, and there's this great scene where she goes to buy his groceries and is like being a real pain in the ass for the grocer.
I did find that one quite moving. I really like the scene where he brings those people round and she's not the typical hostess, and then they say, "Look, you deserve better than his wife," and he defends her, and he starts talking quite passionately about how they shouldn't judge this woman. They don't know what she's been through, and she's actually always been there for him, and they've gone through this stuff together. And that really moved me, like as a sequence, because it's not. He's kind of played as a comedy character up until that point, and the wife is definitely played as like the kind of, he's the henpecked husband, and she's this just obnoxious bore. And then you get that moment, and it peels away and kind of shows more
Oh
humanity
yeah,
to everything.
That's what I was going to say. It goes on to that, and that's really nice. But it just starts and stops, and there's no real further understanding of that bond. But I guess maybe it's a private thing. Maybe we don't need to. But it felt like that could have been explored a little bit more. That felt like a half story to me.
They're not all. Yeah, they're not all as. They don't all have as much meat on the bones as others.
Yeah.
Like I say, like the silver worker guy. He only he doesn't really have a story. He kind of pops into a couple of small sketches almost.
And there's the family. There's the family with loads of kids, and there's the suggestion that they're not all the fathers. And there's a nice sequence where the father says, "Well, if you think I'm your father and I'm here, then I'm your father. And if you don't think I'm your father, then I'm not your father. Who thinks I'm your father?" And everyone puts their hands up and goes, "Me." And it's a moment. There's like that. And the other one both felt like they were kind of half cooked, like there was more to be discussed. But it is, it's a 2-hour 20-minute film. It's a little bit, it's a bit long. It didn't bother me that it was particularly. I didn't find it particularly long, but it's.
It doesn't need to be of epic length. It doesn't really. And I suppose, rather than making, like, for example, the story with the Bolshoi wife and the kind of the husband with the tick, rather than making something that longer, I'd probably rather see some of the longer stories made of equivalent length, and make them more sketchy, go quicker between the sketches, I suppose. But it's a better film than its reputation, I'd say. If we not obviously depends who you talk to, because the Dodes'ka-den brothers are suggesting it's like one of the greatest films ever made, but its kind of general kind of mean kind of reputation is that it's lower mid-pack Kurosawa, and it may still be that, but that doesn't make it a bad film.
It's not bad by any stretch. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's I would describe it as amiable. I mean, which is a bit strange to say when it's obviously got a couple of
quite grim scenes in it. Yeah, I said last time that it reminded me a lot of Jean-Pierre Jeunet's Micmacs, and that's a very superficial comparison that was just born of the fact that they're the only two films I know of, I'm sure there are more, that are like a collection of strange characters who live on basically a rubbish dump, and so I do wonder whether that was kind of a reference point for Jeunet making that film.
Pile of dogs.
That's true. There you go.
There's a trilogy.
Yeah, there's an all-nighter. So so that's I've not got a lot more to say about this one, to be honest. I will say about its production that the maybe because he'd been burned by all these accusations of him being kind of this, impossible to work with guy. This one, he didn't have his usual rehearsals. Normally he had really rigorous rehearsals. They went over things again and again and again in fastidious detail. And apparently here he encouraged improvisation. He didn't really rehearse things very much at all, if at all, and kind of let the actors be a lot freer. And he works with, there are a few people in it who are familiar faces who we see in his other work, but in very small roles. Most of the people here are not from his kind of stock company at all. And it feels very, like, he talks about it being a very happy time making this film, and it being kind of a very freeing sort of like positive vibe around making this film. And I definitely feel that it seems kind of freewheeling, this one, doesn't it?
I can imagine that. There's not a bad performance in there. Like, it's, I can imagine this being a bit of a fun time for actors to sort of, with these kind of range of different roles and people sort of competing over each other a little bit to steal scenes and things like that. It does have a sort of a bit of a freewheeling vibe to it. Which is why I think it reminded me a bit of Altman to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think it almost could have used a pinch more like magical realism of some kind, because you've got the stuff with the guy kind of I mean, this isn't necessarily magical realism in itself, the guy who kind of miming a tram, but it's intercut, like I say, with these kind of magical images at times and these kind of sound effects and these kind of things.
Yeah, you do get that kind of sort of semi-diegetic subjective sound effect. So you hear the sounds of a trolley, even though there aren't sounds of the trolley to anyone but the character. You know, you kind of hear it through his ears, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think possibly it could have used a dash more of that, but then maybe that would have been taking it too much into kind of the whimsical sentimentality that it basically avoids otherwise. Like, it really isn't that kind of film. It's quite complex, I think, to talk about, because it does have like it's a lot richer than it kind of you'd expect it to be, I think, with a lot of the characters that are in it and a lot of the things it touches upon. But I don't think it does so in a way where you would recommend this to anybody as like the really hefty exploration of any of those topics. Like, it's in a weird spot, isn't it? Because it isn't something you'd want to casually put on of an evening, but it's also not the heavyweight class social drama.
No, and some of the there's that kind of plays out a little bit in the. It's weird. It plays out in the art design as well. Sometimes you'll be in these really hyper realistic looking sets or locations of the dump of the water, and then you'll get what looks like a painted sunset backdrop and some really striking colors, and you'll suddenly feel like you're on an MGM stage shot on Technicolor for half a scene or something like that. It's a film that I think wrong foots you quite a bit. I can imagine that I can imagine people really, really liking this if they watched it at the right time, if it struck them in the right mood. I can see people getting things out of this depending on their own personal circumstances and how much they relate to any particular character or any particular story. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, and I think that's why mileage definitely varies from story to story, doesn't it? For sure. Like I say, I think the three that we talked about the most, obviously the ones that stuck in our memories the most from this viewing. So I'm excited to see where it goes on the high and low. Oh, it's crashed again. Basically, it keeps crashing me trying to open that, so I won't open it. Where are you going to put it, though? You can imagine the diagram. We always rate these things on an axis of appreciation versus enjoyment. And where are you sort of sliding on this? I'm feeling like this is possibly a mid-pack entry from your perspective.
I think it's high mid-tier. I'm sort of like 65% of the way on each axis, I would imagine. So maybe a little bit more. Maybe pushing up to sort of more 70s. So,
how do you feel about it in relation to Drunken Angel?
I don't know. It pushes different buttons, and it pushes buttons that I don't feel like
are equivalent to a lot of the others.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of, it doesn't, the nearest thing would be something like One Wonderful Sunday, I think.
I agree.
Like, yeah, even more so than Akiru, because Akiru's still got a very kind of definite story and forward motion to it, whereas One Wonderful Sunday it's smaller, it's two people, and they haven't got any money, but they're enjoying their day out, but it is still got a freewheelingness to it.
Yeah, and also that kind of move between, and it doesn't navigate it as well as Dodes'ka-den potentially, but One Wonderful Sunday has that move between real like wallowing, sobbing grief, and then whimsical like let's pretend there's an orchestra on, let's mime that we're in a shop, and stuff that goes on. So it kind of runs that gamut.
But like you said earlier, like it's surprisingly dark in places, because I think the impression you come away with from it is quite a warm and fuzzy, soft feeling, largely, even if the film isn't always warm, fuzzy, and soft.
I think it is because of Kurosawa's use of color in it. Like it's such a bright, aggressive use of color that I think that's the overwhelming thing you take away from it.
And it's also, I think it's the kind of it's the innocence of the trolley boy that because that's the thing that brings you into the film and he takes you out of the film, and that's kind of what you're left with, is this young lad kind of pretending he's driving a train, saying Dodes'ka-den over and over again, and that it's the beat that you're left on to a certain degree. It kind of takes you a little bit up and down, and kind of spends a lot of time in the middle. But it's where you get off at, and you get off at quite a warm and fuzzy place, I feel.
Yeah, I suppose that's fair. It's very strange. Something that's about this film that's always struck me as kind of odd about it is that if you ever watched the montage they did for the Oscars when they gave Kurosawa his honorary Oscar in 1990, Dodes'ka-den, and particularly the trolley boy, plays an outsized role in the clip of his filmography. Like, it's probably the predominant film they show clips from, which was always baffled me. I don't know why that is, but maybe it is because the clip that they showed the boy being the trolley doesn't really rely on language or dialogue or anything, is it? It's just
when did he get his honorary
1990.
Oscar?
So he had won. So he'd already made, Kagemusha and Ran. Like, if it was just a fact of them wanting to put a color film on, he'd made Kagemusha and Ran. He'd just made Dreams.
I would imagine it's largely to do with color. I can imagine an American TV producer saying, "We can't have all this black and white shit. What's going on?"
Yeah, quite possibly. So next time we're talking about Kurosawa, his film that he made with Mosfilm in the Soviet Union. What do you know about Kurosawa?
Fuck all.
You have any preconceptions about it whatsoever? It's
set in a Russian forest, and it sounded a bit like that film Leave No Trace. It sounded like it was to do with environmental issues. But yeah, I know that there was a Russian version of I don't know anything about the story. This is not 70. I've watched Solaris, and I've watched Stalker, and that is my and I know that there is a Russian version of Mary Poppins, and that is my
70s Soviet knowledge.
That's it.
Yeah. So but you have no preconceptions about it, going in blind. Do you know anything about the plot at all? Like, what's going on in the film?
No, I mean, it's not on the BFI. So let's have a little look. I'll dig into the Criterion channel here. Sorry, I should have been a bit more prepared with this. And it's called Kurosawa, yeah?
It's called Kurosawa, indeed. I remember it's got its fans, because even though it's not considered generally in the upper tier of Kurosawa films, it did win the Foreign Film Oscar for that year. And also, like, I've met several people in my life who think this is Kurosawa's best film. So it does have its defenders.
So the Russian army send an explorer on an expedition to the snowy Siberian wilderness, where he makes friends with a seasoned local hunter. So it sounds like a cross between First Blood and Local Hero.
Excellent. Well, we'll convene again next time to see whether your prediction comes to pass. With that said, that's all I've got in me to talk about Dodes'ka-den, I think. So we'll do that next time along. So thanks for joining us, Craig, and thanks for watching / listening, everyone. Those of you playing along at home, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.